There comes a time in a woman's life when silence says more than 1,000 words, not because she has nothing to say, but because she finally understands what no longer needs to be explained. But have you noticed? When a woman stops explaining, stops chasing, stops proving, the dynamic of every relationship begins to shift. What was once effort becomes ease. What felt urgent begins to lose its grip. Why? Because silence is not withdrawal. It is return, a return to self, a return to stillness, a return to the center from where all authentic strength rises. Most people fear silence because they equate it with absence, but in truth, silence is presence without noise. It is the birthplace of wisdom, emotional regulation, and unshakable self-worth. There is a profound difference between a woman who is quiet because she is silenced by fear and a woman who is silent because she has reclaimed her inner ground. One is shrinking, the other is expanding. One is suppressing her truth, the other is sitting with it, in a world that constantly demands our attention and rewards rapid reaction. The woman who learns to withdraw, not out of avoidance, but out of alignment, starts to change the entire rhythm of her life. This type of silence is not about passivity. It is not the silence of resignation or defeat. It is the silence of inner listening. It is the space between reaction and response where wisdom quietly lives. When a woman begins to practice this kind of silence, especially in the middle of emotional chaos or relational tension, something extraordinary starts to happen. She begins to hear the parts of herself that were previously drowned out by the noise of the world. It is in this silence that clarity is born. A woman who takes the time to silence her environment, turning down the volume of other people's opinions, stepping back from emotional drama, letting go of the compulsion to always be understood, finds herself entering a state of profound presence. She is no longer on the battlefield of proving, pleasing, or performing. She is simply present with what is, and in that space, she meets herself again. There is a story often told in Eastern traditions about a woman who goes to a monk and says, "I cannot hear the voice of truth. I meditate, I pray, I read the teachings, but I still feel confused." The monk simply walks with her to a lake. He picks up a stick and stirs the water until it becomes muddy. Then he says, "This is your mind, always moving, always reacting. Truth cannot be seen in turbulence." Then he stops, places the stick down, and they wait. Slowly the mud settles, the water becomes clear. The monk points, "Now you can see the bottom." The lesson is simple but profound. The truth you are looking for reveals itself in stillness. Modern neuroscience confirms this ancient truth. When we quiet the external stimulation and allow ourselves to enter states of reflection, especially in silence, the brain's default mode network becomes active. This network is responsible for introspection, self-awareness, and emotional integration. It's in these moments that past experiences, unprocessed feelings, and intuitive knowing begin to rise gently to the surface, offering us insight we often miss when we are too busy reacting or explaining ourselves. In relationships, this inner silence becomes an invaluable gift because emotional pain and misunderstanding often arise not from the event itself, but from the way we react to it. A harsh word, a broken promise, a sudden silence from someone we care about. These things can hurt deeply, but it is our immediate, unexamined reactions that usually escalate the wound. When a woman learns to pause, to not immediately respond, not rush to explain, not retaliate, she introduces a gap, and in that gap she regains her power. Think about it. How many times have you said something in the heat of the moment that you later regretted? How often have you sent a message, made a phone call, or lashed out emotionally only to realize later that what you truly wanted was peace, not control? Emotional reactivity is a form of emotional slavery. It means your inner world is being ruled by outer circumstances. But when a woman sits in silence and listens not to the noise outside but the voice within, she begins to respond rather than react. This is the beginning of emotional freedom. The same applies to emotional conversations in relationships. Often when things go wrong between two people, there's a temptation to fix it quickly. We need to talk. Why did you do that? I deserve an explanation. And while communication is essential, timing is everything. Speaking before you are emotionally regulated often leads to more confusion. But when a woman chooses to be still first to regulate her breathing, observe her own feelings without judgment, allow her nervous system to return to baseline, what she eventually says comes from grounded clarity rather than emotional instability. There was a woman in her late 50s who had spent most of her life bending over backwards to maintain peace in her relationships. She believed that if she just kept everyone happy, she would finally feel loved. But over the years, she noticed a deep exhaustion growing inside her. She was always explaining herself, always apologizing for taking space, always communicating in the name of transparency. But deep down, she felt unseen and unheard. One day, after a particularly difficult conversation with her partner, where she again felt the need to defend her boundaries, she decided to do something different. She simply stopped explaining. She sat in silence and let her boundaries speak for themselves. No arguments, no essays, no pleading, just quiet alignment. Something shifted. Not only did she feel a deep peace inside herself, but the dynamics around her began to change. Her partner, confused at first, started to ask deeper questions rather than reacting defensively. Her children began to respect her time more. Friends who were emotionally draining started falling away. She hadn't said anything new. She had simply returned to herself, and in doing so, she changed the energy she carried into every room she entered. This is not magic. It's alignment. Silence, when chosen with awareness, recalibrates your energy field. It changes how others experience your presence. It introduces the quality of gravitas, the sense that you are rooted in something deeper than opinions or outcomes. And this rootedness is felt by others even if they cannot name it. Let us now reflect on the nature of attention. In both Eastern philosophy and modern neuroscience, it is understood that attention is one of the most powerful currencies we possess. Whatever we give our attention to grows. Attention is like a spotlight. It energizes what it touches, and the question becomes, where is your attention going? When a woman is caught in the loops of what is he doing? Why hasn't he responded? What does this silence mean? Her attention is trapped outside herself. This external focus may seem innocent at first, but over time it drains her life force. Her emotional energy is no longer hers. It becomes tethered to someone else's behavior, and in this constant external seeking, she loses her internal clarity. Energy goes where attention flows. If your attention is constantly pulled outward into arguments, into seeking validation, into tracking someone else's actions, you begin to feel anxious, disconnected, and emotionally exhausted. Your sense of power diminishes, not because it has disappeared, but because it's been given away. In contrast, when a woman withdraws her attention from the chaos and returns it inward, something miraculous happens. She starts to feel her own presence again. She remembers her breath. She notices the tension in her shoulders. She realizes the stories she's been repeating in her mind. And as her awareness deepens, her energy begins to gather like water returning to its source. This redirection of attention is not about ignoring others. It's about not abandoning yourself. It's about choosing to stay with your inner experience. Especially when emotions rise to notice, I'm feeling hurt. I'm feeling dismissed. I'm feeling uncertain without immediately needing someone else to fix it. This level of self-observation builds emotional maturity, and in relationships, it changes everything. Psychologists have found that the ability to observe one's emotional state without being consumed by it is a key predictor of emotional intelligence. It's called meta-awareness, the awareness of awareness itself. When a woman develops this skill, she stops acting from her pain and starts responding from her presence. This shift doesn't just benefit her. It also invites others to meet her at a higher level of consciousness. There's a beautiful story of a young woman in her 30s who had recently gone through a painful breakup. Instead of spiraling into overanalysis, she chose to turn inward. She deactivated her social media, stopped asking mutual friends for updates, and began each morning with a simple practice, sitting in silence for 10 minutes, observing her breath and her thoughts. At first, it was uncomfortable. The mind wanted distraction, but over time, she began to feel a strength she hadn't felt before. She started journaling, taking walks, and reading spiritual texts, not to escape the pain, but to understand it. Weeks later, her ex reached out, but something in her had shifted. She no longer needed closure from him because she had already found it within herself. Her attention had returned home. This is not about becoming indifferent or emotionally cold. It's about choosing to no longer be governed by the emotional storms of others. When your attention is anchored inside your own experience, you become a sanctuary not just for yourself but for those around you. Others may not understand your silence at first. They may interpret it as distance or detachment. But in truth, it is a form of deep respect for your own nervous system, for your own energy, and ultimately for the relationship itself. Imagine a woman walking through a crowded marketplace, noises coming from every direction, people shouting, music blaring. Now imagine that same woman stepping into a quiet garden where the only sound is the wind in the trees and the rhythm of her breath. Where do you think she can hear herself better? The marketplace is the external world. The garden is your inner world. Most people live in the marketplace, distracted, overstimulated, reactive. But those who seek wisdom, those who wish to form deeper relationships, learn to return to the garden again and again, not to escape the world, but to understand how to live in it with grace. And so silence and attention become partners on this path. One creates space, the other directs energy. Together they lead to a kind of stillness that is not passive but profoundly alive, a stillness from which all true movement begins. There is no need to chase anyone, no need to prove your worth, no need to keep fixing what others cannot see. Because the moment you begin to focus on yourself and remain silent, the world starts to reorganize around your new center of gravity. Not because you demanded it, but because you remembered who you are. And from here, the journey continues. There is a moment in every woman's life when she begins to realize that being emotionally entangled with every situation is not strength. It is exhaustion. She notices how easily her peace can be stolen when someone else behaves unpredictably. How one harsh word, a delay in response, or a shift in tone can undo hours, even days of inner calm. And she begins to ask herself, not out of fear, but out of clarity, what if I didn't absorb everything? What if I could observe without internalizing? This shift in perspective marks the beginning of emotional detachment, not as a form of disconnection, but as an act of preservation and deep self-respect. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood. It is not coldness. It is not turning off the heart or becoming numb to connection. In truth, it is the opposite. It is the ability to remain emotionally open without being emotionally consumed. It is the capacity to care deeply while staying centered in your own emotional ground. Relationships, especially intimate ones, often mirror back to us our deepest fears, hopes, and insecurities. This is natural. But when a woman has not yet cultivated emotional detachment, she becomes vulnerable to being put into every wave of the other person's mood or behavior. If they're distant, she feels rejected. If they're close, she feels secure. Her emotional weather begins to depend on theirs, and slowly, without even realizing it, her peace becomes conditional. There's a quote that says, "You cannot control how someone treats you, but you can control how long you participate in it." That control, the one rooted not in manipulation, but in mastery, comes from detachment. It comes from recognizing, I feel this emotion, but I am not this emotion. I notice this dynamic, but I do not have to become entangled in it. A woman once shared how in her younger years she believed that love meant being completely involved, answering every message right away, analyzing every tone of voice, being always available, always ready to explain, soothe, or rescue. But after years of emotional burnout, she reached a breaking point, not in anger but in clarity. She realized she had confused involvement with intimacy and self-abandonment with devotion. She began practicing what she called sacred detachment. It began with simple acts, taking a deep breath before responding to a triggering message, choosing to walk away from conversations that only repeated old patterns. spending time in solitude even when others expected her presence, and what she found surprised her. The more she practiced this stillness, the more she could see the other person clearly, without projection, without fantasy. She no longer needed them to behave a certain way to feel safe. She could love them, yes, but from a grounded place, not a needy one. This is emotional sovereignty from the lens of neuroscience. The ability to detach in this way activates the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for self-regulation and executive function. When you are emotionally triggered, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, goes into overdrive, but when you pause, breathe, and allow yourself space, you re-engage the thinking brain. You give yourself the gift of choice. Detachment then is not distancing from people. It is distancing from reactivity. It is placing a sacred pause between stimulus and response. And within that pause, you rediscover your strength. In relationships, especially those that challenge us the most, detachment allows us to stop seeking validation from outside and start anchoring into our own internal knowing. You stop needing others to act a certain way for you to feel okay. You stop chasing clarity from people who thrive on confusion. You stop over-explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you become the calm in the storm, not because there is no chaos, but because you no longer choose to be swept up in it. There's a well-known story of a woman who was in a long-term relationship with a partner who frequently withdrew emotionally. Each time he would pull away, she would panic, calling, texting, trying to re-establish connection. She believed that if she didn't act quickly, the bond would be broken forever. This cycle repeated for years until one day during a meditation retreat, she had a revelation. She realized that the fear she was reacting to wasn't rooted in the current moment. It was a pattern from her childhood where love was inconsistent and unpredictable. She had been trying to fix the past through a present relationship. With this insight, she began to detach, not from love, but from fear. The next time her partner withdrew, she noticed the trigger, felt the urge to chase, but instead chose to sit in silence. She went for a walk. She made tea. She journaled. She breathed, and something unexpected happened. The storm passed. She didn't collapse. She didn't lose herself. Her partner returned, and so did the conversation. But this time she was not the same because she had stayed with herself. This act of staying with one's breath, with one's body, with one's truth, is the heart of emotional mastery, and it leads us into another truth. Stillness is not weakness. In a society that equates loudness with power, stillness is a radical act. We are taught to speak quickly, to respond immediately, to always be doing. But the most profound shifts in life often happen in stillness. When a woman is still, she is not inactive. She is listening. She is conserving energy. She is allowing the truth to rise without force. She is observing the movement around her without being moved by it. Stillness, when practiced with intention, becomes a strategy. It is not the absence of power. It is the consolidation of power. In moments of relational tension, when emotions run high, stillness offers something that words cannot. It offers presence. It communicates, I am here, but I will not play this game. I see what's happening, but I choose not to react from my wounds. I care, but I will not lose myself in proving it. This kind of presence is magnetic. People may not understand it at first. They may try to provoke a reaction. They may interpret it as coldness. But eventually, they feel the difference between someone who reacts out of habit and someone who responds from depth. One woman shared how after years of over-explaining herself in relationships, she began to experiment with stillness. The first time her partner raised his voice, she simply remained quiet, not in defiance, but in calm observation. He paused, confused. "Why aren't you saying anything?" he asked, and she replied, "Because not everything requires a response." That moment became a turning point in their relationship. The dynamic shifted. The emotional energy changed, and she for the first time felt the strength of her own grounded presence. Physiologically, the power of stillness is backed by the way our nervous systems interact. We are wired for co-regulation. This means that the emotional state of one person influences the state of another. If one person is dysregulated, anxious, angry, agitated, and the other matches that frequency, the result is emotional chaos. But if one person remains regulated, grounded, and calm, they become an anchor. Their stillness has the potential to de-escalate the entire interaction. This is not just a theory, it's a lived experience. When you remain still, you give others the opportunity to meet you in that stillness. They may not rise to it immediately, but over time, your presence becomes a mirror, showing them what true stability looks like. In romantic relationships especially, this stillness becomes a gift. Instead of engaging in circular arguments or emotional games, a woman rooted in stillness sets a different tone. She no longer needs to win. She no longer needs to be right. She simply needs to be true, and truth does not shout. It does not chase. It does not perform. It stands quietly and clearly like a mountain unmoved by wind. There was a woman in her 40s who had spent much of her adult life reacting. Every disagreement turned into an argument. Every silence turned into suspicion. Every delay in affection became a trigger until one day she attended a silent retreat. For 3 days, no talking, no phones, no distractions. At first she was restless. Her mind raced, but slowly something softened. She began to notice the rhythm of her breath, the way the light moved through the trees, the sensations in her body. She began to experience herself not through words or reactions, but through pure presence. When she returned to her relationship, she no longer felt the urgency to respond to every comment or defend every opinion. She listened more, she spoke less, and when she did speak, her words carried a different weight. Not because they were louder, but because they were rooted in stillness. Stillness is the soil in which discernment grows. When a woman cultivates stillness, she gains clarity about what deserves her energy and what does not. She stops participating in dynamics that drain her. She no longer tries to fix what is not hers to carry, and in doing so, she becomes more available, not less, for authentic connection, because true connection does not come from emotional chaos. It comes from emotional clarity. In the same way, a river clears when the sediment settles. A woman's heart clears when she stops stirring it with endless reaction. And in that clarity, she can see herself and others more truthfully. Stillness then becomes a way of life, a way of relating, a way of returning home to the self. There is no need to rush, no need to chase understanding or force closure. In stillness, all things reveal themselves in time. And as a woman continues to cultivate this inner landscape, detached from reactivity, rooted in stillness, she becomes the calm she once sought in others. And it is from this calm that the journey of deeper self, focus, and inner nourishment begins. There is a unique kind of beauty that awakens in a woman when she turns her gaze inward, not out of escape, but out of reverence. A beauty that arises not from the way she looks, but from the way she holds herself. When a woman stops pouring all of her energy into external validation, and instead begins to nourish her mind, body, and spirit with intention, something powerful begins to unfold. She doesn't need to demand attention because her very presence becomes magnetic. It's not magic, it's alignment. In relationships, especially in those where a woman has given too much of herself too quickly, there comes a quiet realization. Love that costs you your center is not love worth keeping. This realization is not bitter. It is awakening because it begins the journey of turning inward and reclaiming the self, not in defiance, but in devotion. Self-focus has often been misrepresented as selfishness. Women in particular have been conditioned by culture, by family systems, by subtle expectations to prioritize others first, to give, to serve, to nurture. These qualities are sacred, but when they are not balanced by self-awareness and inner nourishment, they become a form of self-erasure. A woman begins to lose herself in the role she plays. She forgets the sound of her own voice. She forgets what she loves, what she needs, what brings her peace. And so the act of self-focus becomes not an indulgence but a return. A woman who begins to focus on herself starts asking deeper questions. Not how do I make him love me more, but am I showing love to myself? Not why doesn't he call me back, but why am I so disturbed by the silence? Not what do they think of me, but what do I think of myself when I'm alone? These questions do not push people away. They purify the space within so that the connections a woman does allow into her life are rooted in mutual respect rather than unconscious need. There was a woman who had spent nearly 20 years in back-to-back relationships. She was admired for her loyalty, her willingness to compromise, her emotional availability, but beneath the surface she carried a quiet ache. No matter how much she gave, she rarely felt seen. Her relationships were filled with small sacrifices that slowly chipped away at her inner joy. One day, while journaling in the quiet of her room, she wrote a single sentence that changed everything. I have mastered loving others, but I have not mastered loving myself. That insight was the turning point. Not the kind that leads to a dramatic overhaul of life overnight, but the kind that shifts the inner compass forever. She started to change how she spent her mornings, lighting a candle instead of checking her phone, stretching her body instead of rushing into tasks. She began saying no without guilt. She started nourishing her body with real food and her mind with silence. The way she spoke to herself softened, the way she treated herself deepened, and over time her relationships transformed, not because she demanded change, but because she became change. In psychology, this process of self-focus is often referred to as individuation, a movement toward becoming whole within oneself. It's a necessary part of maturing emotionally, especially for those who have historically been overgivers. Individuation allows a person to maintain their own identity even within connection. Without it, love becomes fusion, where the boundaries between self and other become so blurred that a woman begins to lose sight of her own needs, values, and emotional rhythm. When a woman focuses on herself in this sacred way, she begins to source her sense of worth internally, and something powerful happens in her nervous system. The chronic activation that came from being on high alert, constantly reading others' moods, trying to prevent conflict, worrying about being enough starts to settle. Her breath deepens, her posture softens, her voice becomes more grounded, and people begin to respond differently to her. Not because she is performing a role, but because she is radiating from her core. There's a physiological truth here too. The autonomic nervous system, which regulates the stress response, is influenced by our internal sense of safety. When a woman invests in her own well-being through stillness, nourishment, rest, movement, she begins to reset this system. She moves from sympathetic overdrive, flight or flight, into parasympathetic regulation, rest and digest. This doesn't just affect her, it affects everyone she comes into contact with. Her energy communicates without words. I am not here to be rescued or validated. I am already full. This fullness is not pride. It is presence, and it changes the kind of partner she attracts, because people who are grounded in themselves do not chase love. They recognize it when it shows up aligned. They are not seduced by inconsistency, nor manipulated by drama. They can love deeply yet still walk away when peace is disturbed because their self-respect is no longer negotiable. There's a story of a woman in her 60s who, after decades of putting others first, her husband, her children, her community, finally found herself alone. Her children had moved away, her marriage had ended, and for the first time in her adult life, she had no one to care for but herself. At first, the silence terrified her. She didn't know what to do with her time, with her thoughts, with her freedom. But slowly, she began to see the silence not as emptiness, but as space. She picked up painting again, something she had loved in her youth. She took long walks. She learned to enjoy her own company. And most importantly, she began to forgive herself for the years of self-neglect, for the ways she abandoned herself in the name of love, and something remarkable happened. Not only did her health improve, but her relationships also became more genuine. Her adult children started to see her not just as a mother, but as a woman. She met new friends who resonated with her truth. She even reconnected with an old flame, but this time from a place of wholeness, not dependency. This story is not rare. It is the natural unfolding that occurs when a woman turns inward and tends to her own garden first. In relationship psychology, studies have consistently shown that individuals who invest in personal growth, emotional regulation, and self-care report higher levels of satisfaction in romantic relationships. Why? Because they bring a sense of completeness to the connection. They're not trying to extract identity from the relationship. They're bringing identity into it. This difference is everything. It is the difference between needing someone to complete you and choosing someone to walk beside you. It is the difference between love as attachment and love as communion. When a woman focuses on herself, she begins to see through the illusions that once captivated her. The illusion that she must be chosen to be worthy. The illusion that conflict means failure. The illusion that being alone is a sign of lack. She sees clearly that the greatest relationship she will ever have is the one she has with her own consciousness. Every other relationship reflects this one, so she invests accordingly. She begins to pay attention to what feeds her spirit. The books she reads, the conversations she entertains, the environments she inhabits. She notices how her body feels around certain people, how her energy rises or falls in specific settings. She listens to the subtle messages of her intuition. The quiet tug, the gentle push, the sudden stillness, and she learns to trust it, not because it is always logical, but because it is always honest. There was a woman who once said, "When I stopped abandoning myself, everything in my life began to align." She wasn't referring to a specific event. She was speaking of a quiet revolution, one that unfolded over months and years. It was the result of many small choices, saying no when she meant no, walking away when peace was lost, showing up for herself even when no one else did. These choices created a foundation, and from that foundation, love began to grow not from desperation but from depth. This path of self-focus is not without its challenges. There will be moments of doubt, loneliness, and resistance. People may question the change. Old patterns may resurface. But each time a woman returns to herself, she strengthens the connection between her heart and her actions. She begins to embody a kind of feminine power that is both soft and unshakable. This power is not loud. It does not seek to dominate. It simply is. It is felt in the way she walks into a room and does not shrink, in the way she listens without rushing to respond, in the way she holds her boundaries with grace, in the way she gives not to earn love but to express it, and when she does choose to love someone, it is from overflow, not lack. Her love becomes a gift, not a contract. Her presence becomes a sanctuary, not a demand. She no longer asks, "Will you complete me?" but rather, "Can we grow together while remaining whole?" In this way, focusing on oneself becomes an offering to every relationship. It removes the pressure. It dissolves the neediness. It creates space for authenticity. And authenticity is where intimacy truly begins. There is a silence that is not absence but presence. A silence that does not shrink from connection but deepens it. Many people misunderstand this kind of quiet. They think if a woman is silent, she must not have anything to say, or perhaps she is withholding love, withholding truth. But the truth is some silences speak more clearly than any speech. They are the result of a woman who has listened deeply not only to others but to herself. She has sifted through her thoughts, examined her wounds, calmed her breath, and allowed her emotions to settle before offering them into the world. Her silence is not hesitation, it is refinement. From it, her most authentic words eventually emerge. This silence is not passive, it is powerful because it is born from observation. A woman who has trained herself to pause before she speaks, to feel before she reacts, begins to experience a shift in her relationships, no longer caught in the habit of speaking to fill space or to win arguments or to fix discomfort. She chooses her words with care. Her silence becomes a sacred filter through which only clarity passes. Words spoken from this place carry weight not because they are forceful but because they are real. Authentic expression begins with silence. The silence of introspection, the silence of emotional self-awareness, the silence that precedes truth. In relationships, especially romantic ones, communication is often overemphasized in quantity, but undervalued in quality. We're told to talk things out, to be transparent, to express everything. And while openness has its place, expression without depth becomes noise. A woman can say 1,000 words, but if they come from confusion, from pain not yet understood, they do not bridge connection. They create distance. There's a story of a woman who had a pattern of over-communicating every time she felt insecure in a relationship. If her partner became distant, she'd send long texts. If he didn't answer right away, she'd call repeatedly. Her mind needed answers, and her mouth followed its urgency. But the more she chased clarity through words, the more distant her partner became. It wasn't until she began practicing silence, not the silence of coldness, but the silence of reflection, that things changed. She started waiting 24 hours before responding to emotionally charged moments. She began writing her thoughts in a journal first, rather than sending them in a rush. She meditated in the mornings before engaging in difficult conversations. And what she found was simple but transformative. When she gave her emotions time to settle, her words became fewer but far more impactful. Authentic expression is not about talking more. It's about speaking less but with more awareness. It's about choosing truth over reaction. It's about checking within before reaching out. From a psychological perspective, the practice of mindful speech, speaking from a place of inner awareness, activates the higher centers of the brain associated with empathy, self-regulation, and social attunement. This is especially important in intimate relationships, where miscommunication often stems not from what is said, but from the emotional state behind the words. A woman who learns to observe her own inner world before speaking is less likely to wound with her tongue or distort her message with emotional turbulence. She learns to speak not to defend herself but to reveal herself. And what she reveals is not filtered through fear but refined through presence. Stillness trains this expression. It sharpens intuition. A woman who spends time in silence begins to hear the subtle messages within her body. She notices when a conversation begins to trigger her old wounds. She observes when she's tempted to react, to manipulate, to protect herself with words rather than truth. And in that moment of awareness, she reclaims her power. She does not silence herself to disappear. She silences herself to deepen, to ensure that when she does speak, her voice is rooted in integrity. One of the most common sources of conflict in relationships is the habit of speaking without awareness. Two people, both reacting, both projecting, both seeking to be heard, but neither truly listening, the conversation becomes a performance of past wounds. But when even one person in the dynamic chooses to anchor in stillness first, the pattern breaks. The energy shifts because true communication is not just about sharing thoughts. It's about sharing presence. There was a couple who, after years of arguments and misunderstandings, agreed to a new rule in their relationship before any serious discussion. They would both take 10 minutes of silence, no speaking, no thinking about what to say, just breathing and observing their own emotional state. At first, it felt awkward, but soon those 10 minutes became a sacred space. They noticed that what they had initially wanted to say often changed after the silence. Anger turned to vulnerability, blame turned to curiosity, fear turned to self-awareness, and the conversations that followed were no longer battles. They became bridges. This is the gift of inner silence. It purifies intention. It softens defensiveness. It clears the fog of emotional projection. And from this space, a woman can speak not to prove, but to connect. Authentic expression, then, is not a performance. It is a practice. A practice of knowing oneself, of recognizing this is mine to speak, and equally this is mine to hold in silence. Not every feeling must become a sentence. Not every pain must be voiced immediately. There is wisdom in timing, and there is dignity in discretion. One woman shared how after years of emotional chaos in relationships, she began practicing the art of pause. Every time she wanted to react, to defend, to correct, to control, she would place her hand on her heart and take 3 breaths. Sometimes those breaths were enough. Other times she needed hours or even days before she could speak from truth. But when she finally did speak, her words came from grounded energy. She found that her conversations became more honest, less heated, more effective. Not because she changed the words themselves, but because she changed the energy behind them. And the energy behind your words matters more than the words themselves. People can sense when you are speaking from clarity versus when you are speaking from fear. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. And so, a woman who prioritizes inner awareness before outward expression begins to communicate on a deeper frequency. Her voice carries calm. Her presence invites trust. Her silence becomes a space where others feel safe to soften. In romantic relationships, this becomes especially powerful. Many conflicts arise not because people don't love each other, but because they don't understand how to express love authentically. They mistake constant communication for connection. But connection requires depth, and depth requires silence. A woman once said, "When I learned to listen to my own silence, I stopped fearing his." This was after years of interpreting her partner's quietness as rejection. But through her own practice of stillness, she began to understand that silence is not always absence. It is sometimes integration. It is sometimes respect. It is sometimes a sacred pause in which something deeper is forming. And so she stopped rushing in to fill the gaps. She let the space breathe, and in doing so, she created room for authenticity to emerge on both sides. This kind of emotional maturity cannot be faked. It is cultivated through discipline, through self-reflection, through the willingness to feel discomfort without running from it, and through the humility to recognize that just because something is felt does not mean it must be spoken immediately. Silence teaches discernment, and discernment leads to deeper connection. There is a story in Eastern tradition about a master who would only speak once his inner lake was still. His students would come with questions, and he would often wait minutes, sometimes hours, before responding. When asked why, he replied, "Because your question does not deserve my reaction. It deserves my presence." And so he waited until his answer came from stillness, not impulse. Imagine if we approached our relationships the same way, not as a race to respond, but as an opportunity to be fully present, to allow our words to rise from a place of calm rather than chaos. A woman who embodies this does not need to raise her voice to be heard. She does not need to overshare to feel connected. Her silence speaks because it is filled with understanding, and when she speaks, people listen, not out of fear, but out of reverence. This is the kind of presence that transforms relationships. Not through force, but through stillness, not through performance, but through authenticity, not through dominance, but through deep, quiet knowing. Because she has learned that real connection begins not when we speak, but when we understand what is worth saying, and what is best left to rest in the sacred space of silence. When a woman returns to herself, everything begins to shift. Not because she forces change upon the world, but because she has changed the way she shows up within it. By focusing inward, cultivating stillness, practicing emotional detachment, nourishing her mind and body, and choosing authentic expression over reactivity, she becomes the calm she once searched for in others. The silence she embraces is no longer a void, but a sanctuary, a space where clarity grows, where energy gathers, and where truth finds its voice. In this state of grounded presence, relationships evolve. What once felt chaotic becomes manageable. What once drained her now teaches her. The same situations that used to provoke anxiety now invite discernment, because she no longer moves from a place of lack. She moves from fullness. Her energy speaks before her words do, and those who cannot meet her in her peace simply fade away, while those who recognize her depth draw closer, not to complete her, but to walk beside her. This is not the journey of becoming someone new. It is the journey of returning to who she has always been beneath the noise, whole, worthy, and wise, not in the eyes of others, but in the quiet truth of her own being. And it is from that sacred stillness that everything finally begins to fall into